camera glides smoothly through an elegant modern palace, where the gleam of marble and the splendor of crystal chandeliers tell the story of a life of excess. Richard Hawthorne, a real estate magnate, was the center of this universe of luxury. His days were filled with business meetings and international travel, but his true passion was his son, Evan. Evan, an 18-year-old, had grown up amid his family's wealth. His days started with breakfast prepared by renowned chefs and ended with extravagant parties in mansions that seemed more like art museums than homes. He wore designer clothes and drove a sports car that many only dreamed of seeing up close. However, while Evan enjoyed all of this, his behavior began to show cracks. During a reception at his mansion, he made a point of treating the staff as if they were invisible, ordering them around and dismissing their efforts with a contempt that did not go unnoticed. In casual conversations, guests were often targets of his sarcastic jokes, and his ego seemed to grow with every compliment he received. Richard observed from a discreet corner, his forced smile hiding a growing concern. He knew that while the world around Evan was made of gold, the young man's soul was becoming increasingly opaque. Evan's interactions with the outside world, even those involving people from different backgrounds, were marked by a lack of empathy and respect. It was a reflection of behavior that, if not corrected, could lead to a future where his wealth was the only thing he valued. As the night went on and the party continued, Richard found himself increasingly distanced from the joy he normally felt, seeing his son among those who admired his status. He began to realize that perhaps the luxury life he had worked so hard to build was creating a rift between him and Evan. The shine of the gold around Evan seemed to have a cold light, and Richard knew that something needed to change before it was too late. Richard was in his office, the environment enveloped in a silence only interrupted by the soft sound of computer keys and the occasional buzz of the phone. His desk was immaculately arranged, with a bouquet of fresh flowers and a crystal glass of imported mineral water. Yet, even the most refined workspace couldn't hide the worry etched on his face. The flat-screen TV on the wall displayed footage of a charity gala he had recently organized. Richard watched the clips of the event attentively, but it wasn't the success of the party that caught his eye. It was Evan. The young man was prominently featured in several shots, surrounded by admirers and socialites, but the way he interacted with them was deeply unsettling to Richard. In one video, Evan was talking to an elderly lady, a generous donor to the event's cause. The look of disdain on Evan's face as he impatiently listened to her made Richard's stomach churn. The lady, with a kind smile, was trying to express her gratitude, but Evan barely listened and, without ceremony, turned his back on her to get a more expensive drink. Richard stepped away from the desk, feeling a weight on his chest. He knew Evan had not learned the importance of valuing people for who they truly were, and this was just one example of a broader pattern. On several occasions, he had witnessed his son treating the household staff with a coldness bordering on cruelty, dismissing their contributions and often disrespecting them. Richard's concern grew with each passing day. He recalled the years he had worked hard to create an environment where Evan could have the best in life, believing that wealth would bring happiness and success. But what he saw now was a young man who seemed to think himself superior to everyone around him, someone whose worldview was becoming increasingly distorted by his wealth. The sense of failure and helplessness was overwhelming. Richard knew that, despite all his financial and professional success, he had not given Evan what truly mattered: respect and empathy. The light that once shone so brightly in his life now seemed dim, and the man who had always controlled his finances and business found himself helpless in the face of his son's behavior. He stood up from his chair, determined to find a solution. The words echoing in his mind were not about success or achievement, but about a personal crisis that required more than just wealth to resolve. Richard knew that change needed to come from a place deeper than any financial resources he could offer. The night was cold and quiet, with a light mist spreading over the perfectly manicured gardens of the Hawthorne estate. Richard was in his office, where the only light came from a desk lamp illuminating the neatly arranged papers. He sat in his leather chair, his gaze fixed on a framed photo on the desk. The picture showed young Evan smiling beside his grandparents, Helen and George, during a visit to their old home in the countryside. Richard stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the vast grounds before him. The weight of the decision he was about to make seemed to hang in the air. He had spent the past few weeks analyzing every aspect of Evan's life, observing his behavior and interactions with others. The sadness and frustration were palpable in his eyes, and the image of his son drifting away from what Richard had always believed were the true values of life consumed his thoughts. Finally, he sat down again, his mind made up about the difficult decision he needed to make. Richard knew he needed a solution drastic enough to make a real impact, an intervention that could reverse the selfish and disrespectful path Evan was on. Are you enjoying the story so far? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any stories like this one. The idea of sending Evan to live with his grandparents in a small countryside town was not only a practical solution, but also a return to a completely different way of life, where simpler and more authentic values could prevail. The grandparents' home, with its modest garden and cozy environment, was the opposite of everything Evan knew. Helen and George, with their generous hearts and wisdom gained over the years, could offer Evan the perspective he desperately needed. Richard picked up the phone, the weight of the decision growing more real with each passing second. The conversation with Helen and George was brief, but carried a gravity that reflected the seriousness of the situation. They accepted the proposal, understanding the need for a drastic change in Evan's life. Richard felt a mix of relief and pain upon hearing their confirmation. Relief, because he knew he was taking a necessary step, but pain, because it felt like he was, in a sense, abandoning his son in a difficult situation. With a heavy heart, Richard prepared to explain to Evan what was about to happen. He knew that his son's reaction would be anything but easy, and the confrontation was likely to be a moment of intense conflict and perhaps even outrage. But as challenging as it would be, Richard believed this was the only way to reverse Evan's destructive path and give him a chance to find a true sense of respect and humanity. As night fell and silence enveloped the mansion, Richard prepared for the hardest task of all, confronting reality and preparing Evan for a change that, though painful, could be the key to a more genuine and meaningful future. The morning sun slowly rose over the small town of Cedar Grove, casting a gentle light on the peaceful streets and flower-filled gardens. Evan Hawthorne was about to step out of the luxurious black sedan he had brought back with him, a symbol of his former life that now seemed like an anachronism amid the simplicity around him. The grandparents' house was a modest structure with red tiles and a wooden porch featuring an old rocking chair. The scent of flowers and the sound of birds created a symphony that felt almost unreal to someone accustomed to the constant buzz of big cities and the hectic pace of luxury living. Evan got out of the car, dressed in a casual suit that seemed out of place in the rustic setting. His critical gaze swept over the house and yard, noting details he would have previously ignored. The weathered wooden fence, the garden in need of care, and the small vegetable patch where his grandparents grew produce. Helen and George stood on the porch, waiting with warm smiles that seemed as genuine as they were simple. Helen, with her silver hair pinned up in an unpretentious bun and wearing a floral dress, approached Evan with a look of affection. George, a stocky man with calloused hands, waved with a kindly smile. Both appeared pleased with their grandson's arrival, but there was a glimmer of understanding in their eyes that Evan did not fully grasp. "Welcome, Evan," Helen exclaimed, her melodious voice breaking the silence that had surrounded Evan's arrival. "We're so happy to have you here." Evan forced a smile, his expression a mix of discomfort and resistance. He wasn't prepared for the simplicity he encountered. "Thanks, Grandma. It's different." George gave Evan a light pat on the shoulder, a gesture meant to be encouraging, but that seemed a bit awkward to the young man. "Let us show you to your room. We hope you'll be comfortable here." The inside of the house was cozy, but in a way that highlighted the stark contrast with the luxury Evan was used to. Simple wooden furniture, handmade tapestries, and framed family photos adorned the walls. Each corner seemed to tell a story of shared life, hard work, and simple moments, far from the glitz and excesses Evan knew. As he climbed the stairs to his room, Evan noticed the differences in the little things. The room was small, with an old-fashioned quilt on the bed and a window overlooking the garden. There was no advanced technology or modern luxuries, just an environment that exuded a sense of peace and simplicity. Looking out the window, Evan saw a group of children playing in the street, laughing and running with a carefree attitude that seemed so distant from his own reality. He felt a shiver as he realized that what he had left behind wasn't just about material possessions but also about values and experiences he had ignored. The reality was starting to set in. Evan was in a place where every small task, every simple gesture carried a weight and importance he hadn't appreciated before. The life he knew had been replaced by a setting that, while peaceful, was a constant reminder that simplicity had its own kind of wealth. The first few days in Cedar Grove were a whirlwind of shock and discomfort for Evan. Morning light filtered into the simple room, but the feeling of being far from his world of luxury was palpable. Evan got up early, jolted awake by an old, noisy alarm clock that seemed to have more life in it than he did. On the first day, Helen gave him a list of daily chores. For the first time, Evan faced the reality of cleaning the house, washing dishes, and tending to the garden. The first gardening task was a true ordeal. Armed with an old spade and a pair of worn gloves, he struggled to pull weeds from the garden. The sun blazed, sweat trickled down his forehead. But the hardest part was the frustration of dealing with something that had always been done by others in his previous life. As he struggled with the task, he heard George's voice calling him for a talk. His grandfather was sitting in a rocking chair on the porch, a book in hand, with a look of patience and wisdom. "Come here, Evan," George said in a calm tone. "Let me show you how to do it right." Evan, his face still sweaty and slightly irritated, approached. George calmly explained what he was doing wrong, but the grandfather's patience only seemed to heighten Evan's frustration. The young man was used to solving problems with resources, not with effort and learning. Interactions with the locals were no less challenging. Used to being treated with deference and respect due to his wealth, Evan faced a cultural shock trying to fit in with the community. During a visit to the local grocery store where the shelves were stocked with basic goods rather than fancy delicacies, he tried to strike up a friendly conversation with the store owner. The man, an old acquaintance of George and Helen, looked at Evan with a mix of curiosity and indifference. "You're the new Hawthorne grandkid, right?" he asked with no intention of being impressed. "Yes, that's me. I'm here to help my grandparents," Evan replied, trying to keep a friendly tone. But the man's cold response was like a bucket of cold water. "Well, you'll find that things are done a bit more simply around here. There's no room for pretension or pomp," the man said, packing the items with a practical efficiency that challenged Evan's accustomed standards. Evan tried to interact with some of the local kids at a small community event, but the rejection was clear. They weren't impressed by his stories of luxury travels or his manner of speaking. They preferred to discuss the details of the harvest or plan the next community event. To them, Evan was just an outsider, a young man who needed to prove his worth, not with words, but with actions. Every day, the shock of reality became more apparent to Evan. The world around him was shaped by values of hard work and simplicity, something he was beginning to understand in a deep and personal way. The life he had known was fading away, and the reality he faced was a constant lesson in humility and truth. The days turned into weeks, and gradually Evan began to adjust to life in Cedar Grove. Although the challenges remained constant, there was something deeply serene and steady about the presence of his grandparents, Helen and George. They didn't press Evan with explicit lessons or harsh criticisms. Instead, they taught through actions and examples, guiding him to a deeper understanding without direct words. Helen was the first to wake up every morning, and her routine was a choreography of efficient and purposeful movements. The kitchen, where the aroma of fresh coffee and baked bread filled the air, was the heart of the home. She didn't need much to be happy. Her joy came from the simple pleasure of preparing a meal and taking care of her family. Evan watched her as she prepared breakfast, and even though he was eager to start his workday, he couldn't help but notice how Helen seemed to find satisfaction in every task. On a particularly warm day, Evan was sitting at the kitchen table trying to keep up with Helen as she made pies for a community event. Without a word, Helen placed a portion of dough and ingredients in front of him, signaling that it was time to help. Evan hesitated, but Helen's patient and encouraging look made him feel compelled to join in. As they worked together, Helen didn't comment on Evan's past or his lack of experience. Instead, she asked about his day, shared stories about the town, and unknowingly engaged Evan in conversations that made him feel part of something larger. She showed that hard work wasn't a punishment but a natural and rewarding part of everyday life. George, on the other hand, taught through his silent presence and the way he handled the farm tasks. He was the one who took care of the crops and the garden, always with a smile and a murmured sense of satisfaction. Evan remembered the first times he tried to help, only to see George perform tasks with an almost magical skill that seemed to transcend mere manual ability. On a sunny afternoon, Evan was struggling to repair a damaged fence in the garden. The work was hard and frustration was evident on his face. George appeared with a jug of fresh lemonade. Without saying much, he sat down next to Evan and started working on the fence beside him. With a watchful eye and an encouraging smile, George demonstrated how work could be done with patience and care. As they worked together, George shared stories about his youth, how he and Helen had built their life with their own hands, and the importance of every small effort. He didn't speak directly about the change he hoped to see in Evan, but the way George approached work and life was a clear example of dedication and integrity. In every moment, Helen and George showed Evan that true wealth wasn't measured by the size of a bank account, but by the value of a job well done and the kindness in relationships. They didn't force lessons on him, but their actions and the way they lived their lives were a constant lesson in humility and respect. As days went by, Evan began to feel an internal change, a softening of the hardness that had settled in his heart. The constant, loving presence of his grandparents was shaping his worldview, not through words but through an unchanging and inspiring example. The days in Cedar Grove continued with a simple and predictable routine, but for Evan, each day was becoming a new opportunity for learning and transformation. Daily tasks, once met with resistance and disdain, were starting to become part of a new normal. There was something different in the air, a sense of accomplishment and belonging that Evan had never known before. On a particularly hot afternoon, Evan was helping Helen at the local market. The small store was filled with fresh, fragrant produce, and for the first time, Evan began to notice the smiling faces of the customers and listen to their conversations. He started to understand the importance of community and how small acts of kindness and genuine interaction were fundamental to the social fabric. Helen, always with a warm smile, introduced him to some of the locals, and Evan began to engage in conversations that went beyond the superficial. People talked about their families, daily struggles, and the small joys of life. It was a world where status and wealth weren't central topics. Instead, value was found in personal stories and human connections. One evening, Helen and George hosted a small gathering at their home for a few neighbors. Evan helped prepare the meal, a collaborative effort that involved all the family members and some guests. During the gathering, he noticed how the neighbors helped each other, how the children played and laughed together, and how everyone contributed to the celebration with a spirit of camaraderie and generosity. During the conversation, one of the neighbors, an elderly man named Frank, shared a story about a challenge he had faced in the past and how the community had come together to support him. The story wasn't about grand gestures or achievements, but about the strength of mutual support and solidarity. Evan, listening intently, felt a wave of understanding and respect. He was beginning to see true wealth not in appearances but in the depth of human experiences. The impact of Evan's new way of life became even more apparent on a Saturday morning when he helped George plant new seedlings in the garden. The work was far from glamorous, but there was something deeply satisfying about contributing to the growth of something living. As he dug and planted, Evan talked with George about his own challenges and learned to appreciate effort and dedication. Each movement of the shovel and each drop of sweat was an expression of his growing understanding that true value lay in character and sincere effort. Evan's gradual transformation wasn't something that happened overnight, but the change was palpable. His gestures became gentler, his smile more genuine. He started to engage more deeply with the community, and showed a true interest in the people around him. The conversations that had once been superficial were now enriched with empathy and respect. There was a light in Evan's eyes that had been missing before, a spark of understanding that reflected an internal change. He began to see the world with new eyes, valuing every simple moment and genuine interaction. Life in Cedar Grove was shaping him in ways that luxury never could, and Evan was learning to find value in things that couldn't be bought: kindness, humility, and the true meaning of community and mutual respect. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with golden and orange hues, Evan decided to take a walk through Cedar Grove. The streets were peaceful, and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind created a gentle melody that seemed to mirror the transformation happening inside him. Evan passed a small craft store, where a young woman was struggling to organize some boxes of supplies outside. Without a second thought, he approached and offered to help. The woman, surprised and grateful, accepted with a sincere smile. Evan took some boxes and started helping arrange the merchandise, casually chatting about her work and showing genuine enthusiasm for the local crafts. His willingness and interest did not go unnoticed, and the woman thanked him with a sparkle in her eyes. Later that week, Evan decided to volunteer at the community kitchen. It was a weekly event where residents came together to prepare meals for those in need. The first time he entered the kitchen, he felt a bit out of place but was determined to make a difference. With the help of local cooks, he learned to prepare simple but tasty dishes. Each serving and every smile he received was a reward that couldn't be measured in money. On a rainy afternoon, Evan noticed a group of children playing in the street, trying to shelter under a small makeshift roof while waiting for a school bus that seemed to be delayed. Without hesitation, he approached them, offered temporary shelter, and used his own car to take the children to school. The gratitude from the children and the mothers who came to pick them up deeply moved Evan. He realized that small acts of kindness and help could have a profound and immediate impact on people's lives. At another time, Evan helped organize a small fundraiser for the local library renovation, a project that had been underway for months. He not only made a significant donation, but also devoted his time to help prepare for the event. He was involved in setting up tables, distributing invitations, and coordinating volunteers. By the end of the event, the community felt more united and grateful, and Evan recognized that the satisfaction of contributing to something greater than himself was incomparable. In his daily interactions, Evan began to show a new form of gratitude. He was more attentive in thanking the locals for their contributions to his life and the environment around him. Each small gesture of appreciation, from a sincere smile to words of thanks, began to reflect the new perspective he had developed. One day, while helping Helen prepare dinner for some community friends, Evan started to converse with the guests, listening to their stories and sharing his own journey with an honesty he had never shown before. His remarks were more thoughtful, and his genuine interest in the lives of those around him was evident. Evan's transformation wasn't just about big changes. It was evident in every small gesture and daily action. He was learning to appreciate the simple things, to be grateful for opportunities, and to engage with the community in a way that reflected a new way of being. And so, with each small action, Evan was shaping a new identity based on empathy, gratitude, and true human connection. The day of Evan's return to the city arrived with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. The grand Hawthorne mansion, with its imposing walls and luxurious environment, now seemed like a world distant from the simplicity and authenticity he had experienced in Cedar Grove. The black sedan, which once symbolized his status and comfort, now seemed a bit out of place, almost a reminder of the distance he had traveled. When Evan arrived at the mansion, the doorman, who had always greeted him with a distant look, now regarded him with new recognition, noting the difference in Evan's posture and demeanor. The elegant foyer, with its gleaming marble and sparkling chandeliers, seemed to welcome Evan back with a silent reverence, as if it was waiting to see what he had become. Richard was in the living room, seated in a leather armchair, engaged in a video call. Hearing the sound of the entrance, he looked up and turned to see his son walking in. Richard's first reaction was one of surprise mixed with curiosity. Evan was dressed in a suit that, though still sophisticated, had a cut that seemed more casual and comfortable, reflecting a subtle yet significant change in his style. "Dad," Evan began, his voice carrying a new confidence and sincerity. "I'm back." Richard stood up, his gaze softening as he assessed his son. Evan seemed different, not just in the way he was dressed, but in the way he carried himself. There was an aura of calm and self-assurance that Richard had not seen before, a change that transcended the exterior and seemed to penetrate Evan's very character. "Welcome back, Evan," Richard said, with a tone that blended warmth and curiosity. "How was your time with your grandparents?" Evan smiled, a genuine smile that reflected deep gratitude. "It was a transformative experience. I learned a lot about the value of simplicity, hard work, and kindness." Richard watched closely as Evan began to settle back into the house. The young man now moved with a calmness that seemed to contrast with the tension and stress that used to accompany him. When the conversation turned to dinner, Evan helped set the table and made a point to engage with the service staff, speaking to them with a respect and warmth that were new and surprising. During dinner, Evan interacted with a naturalness and empathy that were palpable. He shared stories about life in Cedar Grove with an honesty and enthusiasm that delighted everyone around the table. His conversation was filled with curiosity and genuine interest in others, not just his own experiences. The real surprise for Richard came when, after dinner, Evan gave an impromptu speech of thanks. He expressed his gratitude to everyone for the warm welcome and spoke about the importance of the values he had learned from his grandparents and how he hoped to apply these lessons in his future life. "I've realized," Evan said sincerely, "that true value isn't just about what you have, but about how you treat others and the positive impact you can have on the lives of those around you." Richard, with a heavy heart full of emotion, watched his son. The change in Evan was evident, not just in his behavior but in the way he saw the world. The young man who had returned was a reflection of someone who had found a new perspective and depth. As the evening went on and the conversation continued, Richard felt a sense of fulfillment and hope. He had made a difficult decision to send Evan to Cedar Grove, but now, seeing the results, he knew it had been the right choice. Evan's return to luxury was marked not just by a return to material comforts, but by a new approach to life that promised to bring something valuable to both himself and everyone around him. The night was calm and quiet, with the city lights casting a soft glow over the Hawthorne mansion. Richard was alone in his study, sitting in a leather armchair with a glass of cognac in one hand. The surroundings were a testament to the opulence he had built over the years. Leather-bound books on shelves, a dark wood desk with exquisite details, and a panoramic view of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. But that night, the luxury around Richard seemed almost secondary. His thoughts were entirely focused on his son, Evan. Richard watched the scene in the living room, where Evan was animatedly talking with friends and family, his presence radiant with a new and sincere energy. Richard remembered how Evan's journey had begun. His son, who once seemed so immersed in a world of superficialities and privileges, had returned with a transformation Richard could never have predicted. Evan's interactions with people, the way he expressed gratitude and respect, and the sincerity now evident in every word and action, were clear reflections of the internal change that had occurred. As he watched Evan, Richard began to reflect on the true meaning of wealth. He had built a life of material success, but true fulfillment and value were not found in possessions or status. They lay in how a person relates to others, in the character they display, and in the ability to touch the lives of those around them in a meaningful way. Richard remembered the days spent in Cedar Grove, the letters he had received from his parents describing the struggles and simplicity of life there. He recalled conversations with Helen and George, the stories shared, and the silent lessons his parents had imparted. From these memories, he began to see wealth in a different light. The real treasure was personal transformation and growth, the ability to recognize and value what truly matters. As Evan continued to interact with his guests, Richard felt a wave of pride and relief. What he saw in his son was not just a superficial change, but a genuine evolution. Evan was becoming a man who understood and appreciated the true value of life. He had found true wealth not in the things he owned, but in the way he lived and treated others. Richard stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. The view of the city was grand and imposing, but now it seemed like a backdrop to the deeper fulfillment he was experiencing. Wealth, he thought, was not measured solely by financial success, but by the quality of character and the positive impact one could have on others' lives. As the night wore on, Richard decided to join Evan and the guests. He found his son in the midst of a lively conversation, and as he approached, he saw the look of satisfaction and joy on Evan's face. Richard felt there was something truly special in the air, a sense of accomplishment and a celebration of growth. He placed a hand on Evan's shoulder, a simple gesture but filled with meaning. "I'm so proud of you, Evan," Richard said, his voice choking with emotion. "You've found something that money can't buy. You've discovered the true value of life." Evan looked at his father, and the two shared a smile that conveyed more than words could express. It was a mutual understanding, a recognition of the journey they had traveled together, and a testament to the fact that true wealth lies in transformation and character. The night ended with a sense of accomplishment and new beginnings. Richard knew that what he and Evan had learned was a treasure that transcends material possessions. It was a lesson about what it truly means to live a life of value and meaning, now celebrated in every small gesture of gratitude, respect, and genuine connection that Evan demonstrated. What would you do in Richard's place? Would you have sent Evan to stay with his grandparents in the countryside, or would you have left things as they were? Comment below with what you would do, and don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any stories like this one.